Up until 100 years ago, half the United States population was not allowed to vote. Why? Simply because they were women. However, Idaho decided to set themselves apart from this problem. Idaho was one of the first states to give women the right to vote, long before the 19th Amendment. The fight for women's rights was not an easy one, but Idaho played a key role in making history. In my home, Moscow, Idaho, had passionate voices standing up for women's voting rights. In the late 1800s, the idea of women voting was still controversial, but Idaho stood apart, proudly being the fourth U.S. state where women could vote. Moscow was home to some of Idaho's most influential suffragists. Women at the University of Idaho were highly engaged in the cause. This small city became a hub for activism, where local women and students gathered to advocate for their rights. Local women and students like Minnie Priest Dustin, an Idaho suffragist and librarian, or Rebecca Mitchell, a suffragist who convinced a Republican state representative to introduce a women's suffrage bill in 1893, gathered to advocate for their rights. Their work, along with statewide efforts, led to a groundbreaking moment in 1896. Moscow, Idaho resident William McConnell was governor of Idaho from 1893 to 1896, and throughout his term, McConnell helped pass two suffrage amendments to the Idaho state constitution. One gave members of the LDS Church the right to vote, and the other allowed women. In 1896, Idaho's general election proclamation, signed by Governor McConnell, declared that the citizens of Idaho could vote to grant women the equal right of suffrage. On November 3, 1896, 66% of Idahoan voters voted in favor of women's suffrage. As a result, Idaho became the fourth state in the United States to obtain women's suffrage. Idaho's early decision to give voting rights to women helped fuel the national suffrage movement. On February 11, 1920, members of the Idaho legislature picked Idaho Representative Dr. Emma F.A. Drake to introduce House Joint Resolution 1, ratifying the proposed amendment to extend the right of suffrage to women. Idaho House of Representatives unanimously voted in favor of the ratification. The Speaker declared it passed, and the resolution was sent to the Senate on March 24, 1920. Idaho was noted as the 30th state to ratify the proposed women's suffrage movement. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, many women's groups continued to advocate for women and voting rights. In 1925, the Moscow League of Women Voters was formed and continues to work to educate and inform the public about voting. But while the 19th Amendment is a milestone, it's not the endpoint for women's rights in America. The ERA remains unratified. First proposed in 1923, it aimed to ensure full-length equality for women. It gained movement in 1970, but was never fully ratified, leaving gaps in legal protections. In order to ratify the ERA, they needed approval from 38 of the 50 states, but fell short with only 35 by the 1982 deadline. Efforts to revive the ERA continue today, with states arguing the ratification date shouldn't prevent its adoption, and that gender equality protections rely on laws and court rulings which are constantly being changed or challenged. Adding the ERA to the Constitution would provide stronger and more permanent legal guarantees against sex discrimination. Along with the ERA, the 19th Amendment has had large influence on policy and legislation, such as the Equal Pay Act or Title IX, as well as advocacy for voting rights, women's leadership representation, and increased political participation. While the 19th Amendment was a major milestone, its legacy reminds people that the fight for equality is still ongoing. Women continue to advocate for policies that reflect their rights and needs in a still evolving world. Asked by Cindy Leave, a senior fellow at USC Annenberg, we hear that women got the right to vote. Well, by the way, nobody ever just gets anything from somebody who's in a position of power. You have to fight for that, and a lot of women fought very, very hard for that right. Which is why it's important to keep fighting, to retain that victory. As a woman, I know my voice was once denied, but now I have the ability to continue fighting for my rights. And as a woman from Moscow, Idaho, I carry the legacy of the Idaho suffragists with me.